Duncan, since you kind of were one of the driving force back after 3 years, I'll let you introduce the first story we're going to be covering.
Yeah, so basically I got super into what's called the Thousand Worlds series, which is a series that Martin kind of did before A Song of Ice and Fire. It's very loose to call it a series. It's basically a setting where a lot of his short stories take place. The Thousand Worlds is the informal title given to a collection of stories written by Martin. It includes many of the things that we've covered on Bastards of Kingsgrave already, such as A Song for Lyre, Sand Kings, Night Flyers, as well as his debut novel, Dying of the Light, and the fix-up novel, Tough Voyaging. So these stories take place in a universe where Earth has settled numerous planets, thus forming the Federal Empire. As they expanded, however, humanity entered into wars with two rival alien species, the Harangans and the Findi. This double war ended up destroying the Empire and plunging the galaxy into chaos. So the title, Thousand Worlds, is a reference to the leftover worlds and peoples of this intergalactic melee. Most of the stories are set during the post-interregnum period, as disparate human cultures gradually regain interstellar flight and reestablish contact with one another. However, in this episode, the stories we'll be looking at are Bitterblooms and In the House of the Worm. Both of these are set during the interregnum period. They depict worlds that are plagued by ecological disaster and human societies that have regressed to cultural dark ages, which I didn't realize when I picked these, but Amber pointed out it's a bit prescient to pick them during a pandemic or a social lockdown of society. So the first story we'll be looking at is Bitterblooms. So Bitterblooms is a science fiction novelette by Martin, first published in the 1977 issue of Cosmos Science Fiction and Fantasy magazine. It takes place on an unknown planet. It's about a girl who gets lost in the woods in deep winter. She's rescued by a magical woman who takes her back to her spaceship. So what did you guys think of this story? What should we use to grade it?
I was thinking, was it frost flowers or frost blooms? Was the term of the generic? Not just bitter blooms is one example, but frost flowers, yeah. Out of five frost flowers, what would you give it? I'd give it 3.5 out of 5 frost flowers. I thought it was a good story. I enjoyed In the House of the Worm better in comparison. So I think it's a pretty solid grade, but not the best. That's an okay story in my view.
Yeah, I think 3 is about what I would say as well. I tend to have less positive reactions to sort of post-apocalyptic type stories. Worlds in decayed worlds, or whatever you want to call it, always make me depressed and make me enjoy the story less. They're also there wasn't so much of a narrative. I mean, it was sort of like a classic fairy tale sort of vibe to it, right? Just like the story that she told at the beginning with the family that went there and then ate until they starved to death. Sort of just a really a fairy tale vibe, right? More than there's a real narrative to it.
Yeah, I'd say 3.5 as well for me. I think the actual presentation of the world was really compelling to me. Just the idea of this frozen over world and the sort of ways that people have responded to that. I love the idea that everyone travels by skis, even though that's totally unrealistic, but it was a cool idea. And I thought the way it ended was really strong. I thought it really brought home kind of the theme of the story.
Yeah, I thought it was simple but effective. I like the sense of melancholy and yearning and the way that Martin blended fantasy and science fiction, sort of showing them as two sides of the same coin. I thought the world was really well described, and I particularly loved the image of the old spaceship in the snow covered in flowers. So I'd probably give it, probably 3 frost flowers.
Do we have any information from Dream Songs on the story? I think there's a bit that George talked about it, right? Not a lot?
A little bit, yeah. So he often gives a bit of an annotation in Dream Songs for each of his stories. And when it comes to Bitterbloom, he mentions that he wrote it around the same time that he moved from Chicago to, how do you say that town again? Dubuque?
Dubuque.
Sounds right.
Dubuque, Iowa, which he found was even the winters were even more ferocious in Dubuque. So that influenced the chilly nature of the story. And also the name Bitterblooms is inspired by a song, and he tells the reader, if you can guess what song it was inspired by, you win absolutely nothing.
I wonder if it was around the same time he wrote Ice Dragon. That probably would make sense. I think it was similar. He had moved to a colder climate.
So I think Ice Dragon was, I don't know when it was written, but it was published a couple of years later, 1980. But what I found interesting was this was probably one of the earliest, like, very fantasy heavy stories. So he mostly edged towards science fiction in his early career in the 1970s. But this has like a very, like, it did feel a bit like A Song of Ice and Fire. It's like medieval level technology. The descriptions of the cold is very much like the descriptions of the north and Beyond the Wall. So this feels like it's his first kind of foray into what would become A Song of Ice and Fire, or that setting.
Yeah, he has, what was it, Karen Hall? Yeah, Karen Hall. It sounds like Harrenhal. That's funny.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
The uneven seasons, or not even uneven, but lengthy seasons, like, longer than usual.
Yeah, Deep Winter, I think, goes for years rather than months. And I think the biggest nod is the blue flowers, like the blue winter roses.
Yeah.
So, Horton Edge streams.
Yeah, in terms of the idea of talking about ways in which these stories have kind of culminated in A Song of Ice and Fire, of course, I think the big takeaway for me is that, and he claims it's the Dubuque thing, but I do think there's just a general fascination he has with these sort of frozen wastelands and the ways that makes you changes your cultural behavior. And also the blue flower thing in particular, I thought was really remarkable in as far as projecting the things that, like, the images that George R. R. Martin really, comes back to repeatedly.
It does show how they adapt to a difficult, climate or difficult world, though. They still make the most of it. People make the most of it, the way they're able to have gatherings and still keep their population up at those times.
Coupling it with A Song of Ice and Fire, I think it's interesting the way that it starts out as a fantasy, but gradually you get the context of it being science fiction or the scientific explanations for why there's such long winters, the fact that it's set against this backdrop of the double war and this ecological devastation that a lot of planets have undergone. And you get more of a sense of all the other planets that exist through Morgan's video screen. So I thought that was interesting. Like, it actually, or A Song of Ice and Fire is purely magical, and we get no inkling of any of the explanations behind any of these things. This is an example of a story that gives us both a fantastical explanation or perspective of the world, and then it's sort of more scientific explanation for the world. And both are sort of equally valid in a weird way. I don't know.
So I did want to ask briefly on the Thousand Worlds thing. So is that supposed to be a thing that he had in mind from the start when he started writing all these short stories, or something he kind of applied retroactively to kind of unify all the things that he had written?
It's hard to tell. He sort of describes it in Dream Songs that the 1970s, most of the stories in that he was writing, most of the science fiction stories, were loosely in this future universe or this future setting that he dubbed the Thousand Worlds, because it was so they have a lot of shared elements. So they have a lot of shared places. Several stories, for example, mention Avalon. So this story mentions Avalon, which is kind of this center of human learning that emerged out of the interregnum. Also, like, Night Flyers starts on Avalon. That's where the scientists begin before they go on their voyage. Dying of the Light, they mention Avalon a lot. That's where Dirk and Gwen met. The first story he mentions in Dream Song as taking place in this universe is The Hero, and The Hero actually is set during the Double War, so the war between the humans and the Harangans, which is this alien species. But it's hard to tell, like, most of them take place after the interregnum, so they'll be sort of mentioning back. This is one of the few stories that takes place in a world that is still in the midst of kind of chaos and destruction and ecological disaster.
Well, I think that's important to point out, like, just the way you're using interregnum here. There's two different meanings to it. There's just the general interregnum, as in you've lost space flight and contact with other planets, which many worlds are still stuck in that state, versus, like, there was an interregnum for the main planets that they're over with now. Like, a lot of these side planets are stuck in that mode, but overall, a lot of planets, like, I think when Avalon came back, kind of ended it for a lot of planets, right? They were, like, going around spreading knowledge.
Yeah, the best place to figure out all of this backstory, because, like, reading the stories on their own, you don't get a sense of this. So if you'd read Bitterblooms on its own, hopefully it still works as its own story. But once you start piecing the stories together, you get that kind of shared continuity. The best place to go is the glossary of Dying with the Light. That's actually where it outlines a lot of the history and a lot of the shared planets and whatnot. So once you kind of read through that, you get a sense of all of the people, the historical figures, and the planets that are mentioned in Bitterblooms.
But I think, as you mentioned, like, even though he was working in this kind of, like, one universe from any of these stories. I think, yeah, he grouped it more later on, especially with Dying the Light. I think he finally sat down and was like, okay, let me set the glossary for this. Let me set the exact terms. Whereas before,
I think so, yeah.
Random planets, basically. Or a generic timeline. But the timeline is in such a way that it gives him incredible freedom, right? Because every planet that's doing its own thing can be like on that because of the fall of the Empire. Because of the fall of the Federal Empire, he can do what he wants on each planet.
And we're not believers that A Song of Ice and Fire somehow fits into this.
No. I mean, no, but at the same time, I think that's one of the, strengths or whatever you want to say of the Thousand Worlds, right? Is that you can squeeze just about anything into it if you want to, right?
Yeah.
So
I think he could, but it would be a mistake. I mean, I think Asimov made a mistake potentially with some of it. Like, it sometimes it was a mistake to try to link everything together as an author for your own works.
I agree. Yeah, I think it would be a mistake, and it wouldn't add anything to Song of Ice and Fire.
Yeah, I don't mind if it's something that we could speculate about, but I think you're right that if it's firmly confirmed in some fashion in the story, that would be bad. But like it could be true. Like I'm okay with that being sort of an open question.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of if you look at Ice and Fire, a lot of it you could have scientific explanations, but some of it is really stretching. I mean, so I suppose you could just like the undead being moved around. Like, we're not even talking about corpse habling here. We're talking about literal like things that are dead. Like there's not even a brain there. Like, what are they using, like magnetic fields or something to move these guys around? I suppose you could, but I think that takes away from it. That doesn't really aid the explanation, in my view. It doesn't make it more enjoyable.
Yeah, sure.
All right, I'm sorry. Get back to the story. I just want to...
Sure. That's one of the important questions, I think, that comes up. And I think what leads people down this road is that the themes do come. A lot of the themes do come from these previous works. A lot of the names come. A lot of the ideas George has honed from his past writings, and he's putting them in this, his magnum opus now. But that doesn't mean, therefore, that this work is in the same universe. No, he's just drawing upon previous themes.
Yeah, it's the natural progression as an author, right? Like, you're just going to slowly develop these ideas that define what you want to try to accomplish, and and in this case, it culminated in what happened to be his most successful work, but that doesn't usually happen. But that was lucky for him, I guess.
Yeah, and I think you see that in a lot of his works, both The Song of Ice and Fire and his short stories. Like, this story seems to be about this tension between reality and fantasy, and the fact that we often prefer the fantasy because it's more fulfilling, it creates more wonder in our soul in some sense, and the reality is often disappointing. So you see that a lot with one of the earlier stories that Bastards of Kingsgrave looked at, Morning Comes Mistfall. That's kind of about that tension, like two different perspectives on how the world should be viewed. Like, the scientist says we need to find the actual, cellular truth of anything. And the owner of the hotel is like, well, that doesn't answer all the questions. That doesn't answer all the needs of a human being. A human being needs mystery and needs all these things like yearning and dreams and romance and whatnot. And that seems to be sort of the moral of Bitterblooms. Like, Sean had this really fulfilling life, but at the end of it, she was kind of disappointed and wanted to return to the dream world, to the fantasy world that Morgan weaved.
Yeah, that's it's kind of like the Morning Comes Mistfall kind of relates to this. It's almost like, if you're demanding that this be part of the Thousand Worlds because it must have a scientific explanation, you're like that guy. Morning Comes Mistfall. You couldn't even tell Mistfall from Mistrise.
Yeah.
Just following what Duncan was saying about the sort of theme that he carries into A Song of Ice and Fire and his other stories, I think it came across very strongly for me in this one, in Bitterblooms. Like, I don't know. I don't think overall it was as well constructed a story as in The House of the Worm, but like that ending scene of Sean just like in the snow outside of the ship and just like looking to return to that thing, like you say, after having this life that, any person would be happy with under these circumstances. But like, just like the fact that she's willing to die there in the snow to try to get back to the fantasy world or the things that she was shown, and like ultimately having that revelation that's the thing that she wanted. Like, that was just I thought a really powerful way to end the story, and I think a really effective way to kind of demonstrate that theme.
Just a quick point we were just talking about earlier, how themes and going into this. I mean, George was writing Avalon. I wonder if Avalon was going to be his big book where he put all those themes together, like kind of had that could have been his magnum opus, and then he suddenly switched to Ice and Fire. Like, that's what, like, the view that he had, the vision of the chapter of Brannon in the snow and the wolves in the snow, and then so he switched. But I wonder what Avalon would have been if he'd stayed on that road.
Do you think part of the motivation for that might have been the fact that with Avalon, of course, with things like Morgan Le Fay and all that, that's obviously an established myth, a thing that was made before. And of course, all writing, anything that's created is inspired or affected in some way, but it's a very explicit and clear thing that he's drawing from here. So do you think he wanted to kind of build up more of his own mythology as opposed to relying on things that were previously established?
Well, it's fantasy. He gets to write it. Like, I mean, George sees it all being somewhat similar, just different, backgrounds, different things being used. But he gave him his ability to flex that muscle, right? I think he maybe had enough of like the spaceships, and he wanted to switch over to the swords and armor and all that.
Maybe, yeah. I almost think that you're right, that it literally was just this like one crystallizing moment of seeing that image that inspired all of that. Like that was just the pure motivation of it. Like, yeah. I need to follow where this scene is taking me. But yeah, I just
wonder if he carried the themes that he would have put in Avalon just straight over to Ice and Fire. Like if he hadn't done that switch, he just would have had these same themes in Avalon.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Series.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing though that he would, because I think Avalon was intended to be a magnum opus. It was meant to be like this culmination of all this mythology and whatnot. Like his description, I'm sure I read somewhere that he wanted to be like this sci-fi War and Peace with like multiple volumes. And so he'd probably done a lot of planning before he even started writing, and apparently the writing was going well. But then, yeah, just this image, this particular image that just came to him from nowhere, completely like enthralled him, and he had to follow that. I feel like that's an interesting, like, that clash of science and fantasy. Like, in some ways, science seems more tangible or more real or stronger or more substantial, but that sense of wonder or spectacle can pull you away.
I do think that is possible in science fiction as well, and maybe that's the weird murky ground of, like, language where science fiction is not the same thing as like a fantastical sort of speculative fiction that's set in the future. Like that could also inspire wonder, but the sort of terms of science fiction demand that it be a little more logical. I don't know. I just think like when I think of science fiction, the way I interpret it, it can also inspire that sort of wonder that you can chase. It just so happened that the one that he really was struck by at that time was a fantasy.
Yeah, sure.
Just a final comment before we go back. Go ahead. Do you have some?
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm not sure that I would necessarily. I don't know. I feel like that they're different flavors of wonder, I guess. I think that there's something about magic, like unexplainable magic versus like potentially explainable science, where I think it does have a different flavor. I was just thinking about, what's her name? Sean going back to the ship at the end, and just thinking about like, so when she was on the ship in the first place as a young woman, it was all magical and she thought she was traveling to all these different places and everything. And if she had succeeded in getting back on the ship, really she would have just been doing what we're all doing, which is locking ourselves in our apartment and watching television. Right? I mean, like,
yeah. And she chose that, right?
Right, exactly. Which, I mean, again, makes total sense, right? I mean, like if I lived in a freezing medieval society, I would absolutely want to lock myself in my house and watch television, right? But like, once you recognize what's actually happening, then I don't know. There's something. You lose some romance and something.
No, I get it. And I think the goal of science fiction is always in part, it's sort of to hold like a dark mirror up to our society as it exists when the work was written. So there's a certain element of like just like discomfort associated with that, of having to confront some of the things that we're dealing with in this world today. And fantasy kind of does manage to, and I don't think George R. R. Martin's necessarily trying to do this at all times, but it does kind of have a natural ability to escape from that discomfort and just unsettling aspect of science fiction.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think it's like a fight between fantasy and science fiction. Like Martin has said before, these things are in many ways the same thing. They're just like different. I think he describes it as different furniture or different costumes, but it's essentially speculating and imagining and taking something to its logical conclusion. But I feel like Bitterblooms, it's more like fantasy versus reality, like, and that is not necessarily presented as a good thing. Like in Morning Comes Mistfall, it's kind of, the story seems to side a bit more with, human beings do need fantasy, we do need a sense of wonder. Whereas Bitterblooms, like, you could see it that way, but you could also see it that other way. The way Michael describes is dissociating yourself from the rest of the world. You could see it as the way that people disappear into video games or movies or books. Like, I can't deal with reality. I have to escape into fantasy. And that's not necessarily a good thing, but who knows? I guess it's ambiguous. Sometimes we need that sense of wonder, but if we go too far, we could lose everything.
How is that moderated by the fact that Sean makes that choice at the end of her life? Like, does that change things at all? The fact that she chooses to go back to this as like a last reminder of this special time that she had, or is it not? I don't know. Interesting question, I guess.
Well, if she's going to die anyway, then it makes sense
exactly.
going there.
I think so.
But part of the problem was it seemed that she didn't seem to enjoy her life that much. Her life was weakened because of this experience.
Fair. Yeah, this is definitely a negative spin. You can definitely accept it.
So Morgan in this ship, she was somebody that lived on this world and discovered the world, right? Is that correct?
I think so.
I don't know. My initial thought was that she was from Avalon and that she'd flown there and somehow her ship had been damaged and she was never able to go back. But yeah, maybe she discovered the ship and it's never actually been there, so is only living through the video screens. Yeah, I hadn't considered that reading, actually. That's interesting.
Well, my view of that is because at the very end, Sean goes and she's like, there's the Book of Beth for 60 years ago. 60 years old. It's from 60 years ago. Like, why would she be sure there's a Book of Beth? What is this Book of Beth thing? Is that Beth Morgan?
Well, she'd interacted. Well, apparently she can live really long because of the food, and she'd interacted with previous speakers. But yeah, I wasn't sure. So it could be either way. It could be that she'd come from Karen Hall or come from one of the other castles, or that she'd interacted with them after arriving on the planet. I don't know.
Yeah, I didn't understand the Beth thing. I think that the stronger evidence for for Morgan being a local is the fact that she took her name from the name of the ship, right?
Yeah,
I think that's strong evidence for that.
Well,
but yeah,
she's not sure how why she lives long. She said, I think it's the food. Like,
yeah,
you think she would know that if she came from Avalon,
right? Exactly. Yeah.
I interpreted that as a kind of, with the name of the ship and with the living long, it's kind of like a Gollum situation where, like, at some point she forgot her actual name and she just took on the things around her, and just for whatever reason, just like because of living for so long, like she lost those aspects of herself from the past.
And that might be the cautionary message that, had, like, if she was a person like Sean who sort of dreamed of more and dreamed of adventure and came across this ship and kind of just got lost in it and lost in fantasy, and that maybe Sean, as an old woman coming back to it, that might be her same fate. She might go into the ship, become lost in fantasy, and try and lure other people into it to sort of groom or to whatever.
I was curious, how did people interpret the ice wagon? Because when I first read it, like, the thought I had was like it was some kind of like version of Apollo's chariot, except it causes deep winter instead of like bringing the sun to warm everything. But that doesn't seem to be what's going on. It's like, how did people think about what that was?
I just thought it was a constellation. I don't know.
The two blue eyes, I think, right? And I think it was. They say it's the reason why it's cold. Now that could just be mythology or whatever, right? But it could be. It could also be that's part of the reason. Like maybe there is. I mean, they could be remembering. I mean,
it's some kind of like spaceship that's blocking the sun or something.
that or like, I mean, they remember, like, remember these people came from Federal Empire. They used to have spaceflight, right? So they originally maybe knew why it was cold here, and maybe if they are for some reason sure that this constellation is the reason why, like, Ice Dragon makes everything cold and it takes you away when you die. Well, maybe, whatever it is, maybe that thing is causing it to be cold, that particular geometry of this solar system. That knowledge might be true, they just remember it as fantasy now. Like
or it's possible that, like, whatever weirdness is going on with the planetary's, planetary orbit or rotation or whatever, that it happens that in the winter, they now see this constellation instead of, what they would see in the summer.
Well, it might be causal, it might not be. It might just by fluke.
Yeah, exactly.
Fluke that it's
may
there,
or may not be.
Or it may actually be the cause, and that's why you see it.
Right.
They come near, they orbit nearby, and like it could have. If it wasn't uneven, if it wasn't like the weird seasons, if it's just cold, you just say it's just a small sun or something. But because of the switch, there's some other stellar situation that's creating it.
It's hard to tell because the people here obviously weren't originally here. They're a settlement that's kind of fallen back into, medieval, whatever. But it's hard to know, was that caused because they've lost contact with the home colonies, lost contact with Earth for, thousands of years and have fallen into this, or has something happened to them? Like, did the double war affect the climate in some way? Did, a biological ship affect the climate and made it perpetually cold, and that's kind of flung them into this regressed, society? But maybe it was always cold and they had ways of buffeting the cold or protecting themselves against the cold. They had spacesuits or whatnot, and they've lost that, and now they just have to survive on their own.
It's definitely a fun mystery, just to speculate.
They probably were just, smacked down during the war, and they lost contact with the outside, so they lost their technology and weren't able to recover it. Well, I mean, here's the whole thing with these vampire things, right? Like, what the heck are these vampires things? I started thinking back to, Tough Voyaging and stuff, those different species that were either produced or used by the Harangans. Like, it could be that some of those were loosed on this world and it just kind of broke down.
Also reminded me of I guess I read this one first, but retroactively reminded me of the worm thing too, right? With the two different races that are, and
point.
They could have just diverged or, been created different, or, who knows?
Yeah, so, I mean, it could be a human species has been deformed by biological warfare during the Double War. It could be one of the Harangan slave races, because a few of them are mentioned.
Let's see. Githrank.
Yeah, in the next, hopefully the next story we're going to read in the next episode, and 7 Times Never Kill Man, they mention one of the slave races and they refer to it as like a mind vampire. But the way it's described is different to what we see here. This vampire creature, it sounds more like a dactyloid, which is kind of like a winged pterodactyl creature that the Harangans would use in warfare. So the fact that it has wings and it sort of screeches and whatnot. It doesn't fly. It only seems to run on the snow, but it sounds a bit like a dactyloid.
Probably just an adapted Harangan species. I'm sure they probably had many, or they adapted over time. Like the origin was that could easily.
Yeah, like maybe the winds are too extreme for them to fly. But the idea, I guess, would be that it's a slave race. But since the Harangans were destroyed, the slave race is kind of just free to inhabit areas.
Yeah, it reminds me of Kavalar, right? That was the same thing with the Kavalar world, right? Like they were all these races that were still around and had to be dealt with.
Yeah.
Okay, that was my main question in terms of just the textual stuff. Other than I think Beth, 60 years old. That's too recent. Like Morgan seemed like she was older than that, but maybe Beth had some. Maybe not. Maybe it is Beth who came here at the end of her life. But they were talking about this other family that apparently starved in the cold. Remember that? I don't know if there's any thoughts on that or what happened there.
Yeah, I sort of just believe it as it was told, that a family starved because she was feeding them fake food. And like her, they sort of went crazy or starved because they weren't actually being nourished with anything. It's not clear to me why she's able to live so long, though.
Yeah, it can't be just the food.
Like, if she's still a human being, surely she'll still die. But yeah,
maybe she's not a human being. I mean, she's AI or something.
Well, I mean, there's all kinds. I mean, just like even our, like we don't know what kind of like weird medications or nanotech or who knows what. I mean, like there could be something in the food that causes telomere shortening not to happen, right? I mean, like it could effectively,
The rest of the worlds don't seem to have that though, unless this.
Oh, I see. Sure, I guess that's fair.
Do you actually ever get to go to Avalon in the Thousand Worlds? Is that a thing that happens?
They start from Avalon and Nightflyers, don't they?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's the closest. That's the only one.
It never comes up. They're eating food that keeps them alive for 300 years. I mean, Claronomus has to do all this like cyborg stuff to stay around. It's not like he's eating nice bread and he lives longer. Like
he's the only figure that lives centuries, because all of his shipmates die during the voyage to sort of survey the galaxy after the interregnum.
Yeah. And we don't know what she means by lives long, I guess, either, right?
Good point.
I mean, we don't know how long that actually is. Like, it might just be like, I don't mean just, but like, it might just be like 120 or something.
Double what they normally might live.
Yeah.
There, maybe even a little bit longer, right?
Yeah.
If that's the case, then if the story of Beth is 60 years old, it makes sense. Although, kind of, right?
Yeah.
It's within that time frame.
Right.
All right. So 2 other quick comments. Craig seems like a douche, but maybe he's also like, he's a product of his society, right? It depends on the different voices do different stuff at different seasons. Mushrooms are served, so there's mushrooms in this story and the next one. George,
there's a ton of mushrooms in the next story.
Mushrooms are often served in George's story, including Hufflepuff. Mushroom bread. That's something I want to try now after hearing about it all the time.
There's also a lot of incest in both stories. Like they're attracted to their siblings.
It describes at the beginning Lane, the person who dies, as a father, brother, and lover all at once, which is an interesting combination of associations.
But I feel like when it says family, they really mean clan. That's what they mean.
Like, playing different roles.
One actual biological family, but a couple of close-knit families.
I'm not sure exactly what lover means. Like, Morgan also described Sean as a lover, and I don't think there's any actual sex. Maybe it was just in the background.
Oh, the sex is.
I think there is. Yeah,
okay, I thought it was implied. You don't
I think it's implied, but I think it's there.
The brother is the weird. The father part you can see like he's kind of like our mentor and helped her get away from Craig. The brother's like, what do you mean?
Right?
Is this brother because you're from the same clan? Maybe that's it. Like your blood brothers or something. Like your clan brothers. Maybe that's the term they always use that.
But, yeah, could be. I think Zach, you mentioned there was sort of a few allusions to mythology. To Avalon is a mythical island in Arthurian legend, but also Morgan Le Fay is a powerful enchantress in Arthurian legend. She becomes an apprentice of Merlin, and she's described as like sexually active and even predatory, just kind of what we see in this story. And I thought it was interesting, like we get these mentions of Chloronymus and all these other historical figures in the Thousand Worlds universe, but I did a little bit of reading on Avalon in the Arthurian legend, and apparently it's referred to as the Island of Apples. And I thought that the way that Martin's using it, it almost has like Christian imagery, like the idea of like the forbidden fruit of knowledge, because that's where Chloronymus founds the Academy of Human Knowledge.
Correct me if I'm wrong, also Avalon, only like fairy women can go there. Is that correct?
Possibly. I think that's where Morgan Le Fay is from, and she's referred to as a fairy or a witch or something. I think Arthur goes there after he's been famous.
Yeah, Arthur gets to go because Arthur gets to do whatever.
Yeah. And he gets revived. But yeah, maybe only fairies or magical folk can go there.
I was curious about all the names that are mentioned in association with Morgan, like all these other like mythical people. Like, do those appear? Like Erica Storm Jones and Stephen Cobalt Northstar. Like, are these people that appear? Or Stephen? Did these appear in other stories?
No, so none of them appear in stories. They're just historical figures. But, for example, Stephen Cobalt Northstar, he was like a famous general during the Double War, and he famously rebelled against the Federal Empire, and that's kind of what led to the collapse.
Okay.
Who else is mentioned? Chloronymus was the famous.
Right? He does appear. Doesn't he?
Oh, sort of. Yeah, there is a story called The Glass Flower, which supposedly features the cyborg Chloronymus, but that's kind of the point of the story. Is he actually Chloronymus, or is he an imposter? Okay. But Chloronymus was he was injured during the Double War, and then basically brought back to Avalon, revived as a cyborg, and then during the interregnum, he had a task to take a scientific survey ship out to go and discover what human civilization was at this point, whether there were any humans out there. And basically try and reestablish connections between human colonies. So he's quite famous, and then he founded the Academy of Human Knowledge on Avalon. So yeah, they mentioned a bunch of people. A few of them are explorers. Celia Marcian, Interregnum era space pilot.
Yeah, Melancholy, so they are mentioned. Tomo.
Melancholy, yeah, I think they were explorers as well. I think they are mentioned in Dying of the Light. But none of them actually appear, except maybe Chloronymus, but they're all mentioned in lots of other stories.
And the fact that they're mentioned makes it that this ship came after all of that. Which is kind of weird. Like, this ship came to this world after all of that and just landed there?
Yeah, potentially, because most of the figures are, like, either during the Double War or before, but Tomo and Moss, I think, they're after the interregnum. They're, like, a few hundred years afterwards. So the story might actually take place after the interregnum.
Well,
even though this world,
it's after like his whole story, right? So this is after the main interregnum with all those planets as we end. Now these planets are still cut off. It's just kind of weird. The ship just came to this planet. Maybe it crash landed here. That's along the line that maybe it was actually Morgan came from somewhere else and she was stuck in their ship. But it seems to be working. You think you could set up a distress? Like, it's kind of maybe it's more likely that she found it and didn't know how to fully use those other elements of the ship.
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to tell whether whether it crash landed or she came with it. So I think it's described as some worlds, the interregnum lasts like 5 years, and then they were back on like Avalon. They were able to regain Starflight pretty quickly, whereas other worlds are still in interregnum like sort of hundreds of years after the war.
Interregnum lowercase I. That's the way I view it, right? Interregnum uppercase is for those main planets are now like that phase is over, right? Of near that, like, all those planets near the edge or whatever, near Wormhole.
Yeah.
So
like a historical period versus like a sort of a planetary state of progression. But yeah, there's potentially still hundreds of worlds like the world that Sean's on that are still kind of in chaos and haven't been reconnected with.